Welcome on behalf of the members of the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus from Trenton to you. I am your host, New Jersey State Senator Ronald Rice, and Chairman of the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus. As you know, Newark, New Jersey is a very interesting city, and it's the biggest city in the state of New Jersey. But many of our urban cities throughout the country and those here in the state of New Jersey are going through what we call a renaissance now. We've seen a lot of hard times, but we've seen renaissance before, and they just stop in the midst of the renaissance, and it seems as though we backpedal. But Newark is one of those cities that have had that come and go type of motion, if you will. And I told many of you that I came home from Cuba when I was in the Marine Corps in 1967, the night of the Newark disturbances. And I didn't even know it was a riot taking place. But I watched the city after I got back from Vietnam start to turn corners under the leadership of Ken Gibson. And I know the state and federal government made it very difficult for him with the condition the city was left in after the corruption. And then we led the charge, and we had Mayor Sharp James take office to succeed Ken Gibson, and he built on the foundation of the Gibson administration. A lot of good things happened then, and as always, a barrier got in the way. There were some improprieties, there were talk of corruption, school board fights, and things of that magnitude. And then the economy just kind of set itself down a little bit with the recession. And so the Renaissance stopped. And as Mayor James used to say, we were going from ashes to Renaissance, the rebirth itself. Now under the leadership of Mayor Ras Baraka, a young man that many of us have watched growing up in the community, he's doing a fine job in his 3.5 years as the new mayor, who inherited, as I told you before, a $93 million budget deficit, $73 million deficit at the Board of Education, and corruption in Newark watershed, and those investigations are still going on, from what I understand. But with all that, and the state coming in, monitoring and telling them what to do and what not to do, he was able to start to move the city again, and all of a sudden you see a flourishing downtown, you see activities taking place in the city, and I think we're right back on the path of the Renaissance again. But there's a history to Newark, a very, very, very rich history to Newark. Starting with the Quakers, and we can go back when the city was founded. We can go back to the time when I first went on the city council. You know, that's history too, because I was the first African American to represent the West Ward. We had a very good person maintaining his history of Newark for a number of years, Mr. Charles Cumming. Many of you have read his books and stayed up with the history. And we have the Newark Historical Society, but we also have an organization known as the Newark History Society. And I believe there's a difference between the two. And we're going to tell you those differences in a minute so you don't get confused, because you always hear about the Newark Historical Society, but many of you, when you hear about the Newark History Society, you think that's a short acronym for Historical Society, when in fact it's not. This is the organization that maintains and keep up and give you the real rich history of our city from the beginning to where we are today, and they'll be there to tell you where we are tomorrow. And so with that being said, I would like to welcome to our show today Mr. Timothy Crist, who is the president of the Newark History Society, and one of his trustees, Mr. Walter Chambers. And I'm just so happy to have him here, because we don't talk enough about history. We talk about the negative impacts and things that are taking place in our cities. We even talk about the good things that take place in the cities. But we never talk about the history. And I think it's important for those of you at home to not only remind you, some of you, of the history and give it to some of you newcomers to Newark, New Jersey, but also it's important for our young people to know our history. The history of African Americans, you know, from slave and indentured servitude to the present, and all the struggles we've been through, the history of cities, the history of country, history of the international community, and the history of other ethnic groups too. That's very important. History is the key, I believe, to success in life, along with a little bit of reading and math and English now. You know, you have to have that too. So with that, let me turn to the president first and say welcome you, Mr. Crist, and we're going to call you Tim affectionately, if you will, on this program. And we're going to ask you, as we always ask our guests, to kind of tell us something about Tim Crist, a young man growing up, he's a little boy, you know, where you're from, the things you like to do. And then we're going to turn over to Ward, and we're going to raise that same question. And then we're going to get into some talk about the Newark Society, History Society. Okay.
Well, thank you, Senator Rice. It's really good to be here. I arrived in Newark about 40 years ago, so I bring, in some ways, an outsider's perspective. But I fell in love with this city. I fell in love with a Newark woman, too. And I like to say that our children are fourth generation born in Newark. So we have our roots here and are pleased to be part of this community. I studied history in college and in graduate school, and I'm the sort of person who always likes to know the backstory to things, the backstory to people and the backstory to places. And that's how I got very interested in the history of the city of Newark. I worked for the Prudential, one of Prudential's investment subsidiaries for nearly 40 years, and I recently retired, but delighted to be able to continue to work with the Newark History Society.
You retired just when Trump and the market was crashing. You said we're doing pretty good, but it started to crash these last couple of days here, you know.
Some good timing.
So we can't blame you for that, right?
No, please don't.
But you can give us the history of it later, right?
Yeah.
I know you can. What about you? Tell us something about yourself. You're a Newarker, right?
I'm absolutely and proud to say that, and I always admit that to everywhere I go, that I am from Newark, New Jersey. While since 1968 I have lived in East Orange, but I'm really a Newarker. And everything I do and everything I talk about is Newark. I was born and raised in Newark. I was born here, I'm happy to say, 1931. So that, without doing the math, I'm 86 years old.
God bless you.
My family, much like Tim described within his family and his children, but my family goes back 4 generations in Newark. We were sort of talking about names of streets and all, and I was born in a house on Camp Street, if anybody knows that, that street.
Over near the health department.
So short 2-block street, running from Broad Street to Mulberry.
Yeah.
And my whole family is from Down Neck, the east side of Newark. I grew up there, went through elementary school, graduated from Oliver Street School, East Side High School, in June of 1948. Let me put a note in about the composition of Newark back in those years, as opposed to what you see today. When I graduated from East Side in June of 48, there was then the largest graduating class from that school. And if you recall, back in that era, there were 2 graduations a year, in January and June. We graduated in June with 300. Of the 300 members of that class, there were only 7, well, now we say African Americans and we say Negroes or color, whatever. But that gives you an idea of the composition of the sections of Newark back in the mid-1940s. From East Side, I went on to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, getting my bachelor's degree there. Then into the military. We had compulsory draft in those times. The Korean conflict was going on. Came out of the service in 1954. And my very first job, real job I'll call it, was in Newark City Hall in 1955. I was appointed Assistant Director of the Mayor's Commission on Group Relations.
And that was Leo P. Collins?
Leo P. Collins was the mayor, the first mayor after the charter change, which is another subject unto itself for people to understand the history of Newark. I worked there for some 5 years and left for a number of reasons. But I said, this is not the life for me. But I enjoyed it. I learned a lot there. And I moved just up the street to the Kinney building, that Broad Market, and worked for the National Conference of Christians and Jews. So my field in the early days of my career was in the field of human relations, you can call it. And then I worked for them for some 3 years. I was promoted to be director of the regional office, because the national conference, as the name indicates, was a national organization. Right. In 1963, I was appointed director of the Queens, New York region. being the first black director in the country in the organization. And I was only there some 3 months when in January of 1964, the telephone company, New Jersey Bell, as it was known then, called and wanted to talk to me about a position they had.
Okay.
I was at a time, again, another part of Newark's history, when they were dealing with the organization CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality.
Yes.
And we're camping at their door, and they realized they needed somebody to help them through all of this.
Yes.
And I got that job and then made it clear as I came to them, working in the personnel department, that I wanted an opportunity to be in the mainstream of the telephone business. I didn't want to come in here and stay as a specialist.
Right.
True to their word, this did happen. Some 2 years after I was there, I was put into what we would call operations and carved out a career with several significant promotions along the way. I worked there for 31 years, rising to the level of assistant vice president.
Very good.
So that's sort of my work
That's a
career.
great, rich history, and I think it's important for our young people to understand that history, that there's opportunities. From the black perspective, we can always grow, but we have to be focused and interact. And then you have to take advantage of opportunities, too, because we still live in a society that's backwards. All the progress that African Americans have made over the years, particularly back in the 50s and 60s, is starting to turn and go back in the hands of time, as Tyrone Davis used to sing about, and Pearl remember him. And so that's important, particularly with the new administration, the Trump administration. It's a little loose there, and people think they can say and do what they want to do. So when I talk about timing, there's a need not only for your wisdom, your education, that's why we emphasize education and knowledge, but believe it or not, that's going to be a need for you just because you happen to be a minority or a woman. Because someone has to do the same thing that Ward Chambers had to do when CORE walked in, is talk to people and try to mediate the situation and educate people on both sides. And that was the same thing that happened with the Colonel's Commission report, because President Johnson, during the rise, thought that black folk were just doing things crazily for all kinds of racial reasons, and that white folks were doing things crazily for all kinds of racial reasons. So he put the commissioner out. And the commissioners came back and reported, and he's looking for all these bad things about communists and everything else, and black power movements. And they said, no, it's none of that, Mr. President. So he said, well, what is it? Well, you have a problem. It's going to cost you some money. What's the problem? Well, the people need housing, the people need jobs, people being discriminated against, etc. So we're kind of back in the same scenario today, and the history is important for those reasons. And so, and I do remember CORE and those days, et cetera, because I was moving behind you, generation-wise. There's like, a little gap there. But I did the Vietnam thing, you did the Korean thing, but we both came through a period where it was a big draft in the city of Newark, and the state of New Jersey, the biggest they've ever had was during those two wars, since World War II. So with that, Tim, why don't you tell our viewers, what is the Newark History Society? And I think Ward gave a good prelude to it because he was talking history, and I think that's important.
Well, we're a group, we're all volunteers, but we're focused on Newark. And we sponsor several public programs a year, conversations, presentations of research. We also encourage research into Newark history. One of the things that we feel strongly about is that if we can get those who have done the research to share the results of that, but also hear the personal experiences of Newarkers and put that in historical perspective, that it adds value on both sides. And we also think strongly that by understanding our past, we can gain a better appreciation of what's happening now and plan better for the future. If we forget our past, then we're more likely perhaps to repeat some of that. But there are so many good stories in Newark. A group of us started it about 15 years ago. You mentioned Charles Cummings earlier. Charles Cummings, who was the city historian and an assistant director at the library, got together with me and another man, Warren Grover, And we recognized that Newark was the largest city in the United States without an historical society focused on Newark. Newark's always been home to the New Jersey Historical Society on Park Place, and that started way back in the 1840s, but its focus is the entire state. There was no group really focused on Newark itself. Warren was finishing his research, which is now more relevant than it perhaps was even then, on Nazis in Newark, a real study of how Newarkers responded to white supremacy efforts and to domestic Nazism in the 1930s, and collected a lot of oral history and led to his book, Nazis in Newark. The three of us got this launched about, as I say, 15 years ago in 2002. We've grown since. We have over 200 members, 500 on our mailing list, a good response to our public programs, and have found that there's no lack of topics and issues to look into. We have our work cut out for us.
You know, I always tell people, I say, if you were to take Tom Gibbon, who's the Assemblyman now, his memory and his mindset on history, I mean, he can just look at you and go back 30, 40, 50 years. It's amazing. He's very unique like that. I said, if you really talk to Ken Gibson, you talk to Julius Williams, if you talk to Sharp James, I mean, we all have stories to tell, and some of them are so funny and some of them are so pathetic. I said, everybody should really take and do a page or a chapter or a paragraph, and you have a very interesting book, you know, about the relationships and the politics and the good times and the bad times. A lot of people don't know who are new to New Jersey, and I said new, I'm talking about last 30 years or so, okay? 40 years, don't realize back in the 50s and 40s, et cetera, even the early 60s, you could actually go downtown. A million people passed the corner of Broad Street, you know, over a period of time. But you can go downtown there. You wanted country and western music, you had it.
All that,
you wanted to go to the burlesque, you had that too. You want jazz, you had that. You want to eat, whatever you want to eat, you had it, okay? It was just a great, great city. And it's still a great city, but the Kresge buildings and the Kleins and the Orbachs, you know, and the Woolworths, you know, things that we had, we see some renaissance taking place in those buildings after years, but it is a rich history, and that story needs to be told, because I think the more you tell the story, the more people who don't know the history can kind of imagine it and would like to see some of those things in place. And that's one of the reasons that Mayor James, when he was mayor, and Mayor Baraka now, and myself, we always talk about creating a downtown where people walk around, you know, close off Horsey Street, and how people walk through those areas with shopping centers and eateries. And you can see the eateries and the shoppings coming up now. And then let them walk down Broad Street, you know, connect Route 21 to East Ward, where Ward grew up, you know, and then the next section was called East Park, Newark. But those folk down there, because of the diversity change, unlike the old days, they used to come to Broad Street.
Right.
But now the Portuguese, Brazilian community, they pretty much stay on the one side of Route 21. And the whole idea of making Newark pedestrian friendly is to start to bring the interaction between all the wards, and particularly the 21 divide, if you will. And I think that's important for people to understand. So history is important to make you realize how you can actually plan out a city. You know, it's a good foundation as to what it used to be and where it should be, and you can kind of put the two together and come out with something unique. And I think that's what Mayor Baraka is trying to do, even during some difficult times. Why don't you tell us, because you would know this just as well as Chris, and he can weigh in too, what makes the Newark, you know, History Society so special, you know, such a special group? And then are there partners to the group? You say a lot of members, but is there a partnership as well?
Yes, we do have a partnership, but let me answer the first part. You say, what makes it so important? For many of the reasons that you just cited, the importance for people to understand and remember the rich history that is Newark, New Jersey. Okay. You mentioned about, you know, and today and what we're trying to develop in pedestrian and traffic and so on. Newark had that back in the day when I was a child. Downtown Newark on a Friday and Saturday, you couldn't move at Broad Market.
That's right.
It was so crowded. You know, this is, of course, the years before all the malls and all that sort of stuff. So people came from the suburban Essex County and others came to Newark to shop and for entertainment. You mentioned all the various musical venues as an example that you had in Newark. The country western was from South Broad Street,
That's right.
and you
That's
come
right.
on up. You had
You
everything, including burlesque,
Yes.
that was prominent here in Newark.
Yep.
And shopping, entertainment, everything was the center of activity up here in North Jersey was Newark. And we, through some of our programs, and we certainly go back even further, that our president, Tim, is an absolute expert in colonial Newark and can bring that alive for you. Say, oh, I'm not interested in that. When you hear him describe and talk about it, just amazing.
Well, you know, it's interesting because you mentioned, and you're right, not only did you have the country western on South Broad, but the reason we named Frelinghuysen Avenue after Frelinghuysen is because we had the cows and the leathers and all the glue stuff down there as well. So you went to the country west, it had a little odor down sometimes too.
Oh, yeah.
You also had some chicken coops. Yeah. And if you come back up on the South Broad Street side and just kind of went around off Clinton Avenue, you had the stables. You remember
That's
the stables
true.
where
Oh,
all
yeah,
the vendors would come out? You know, so it was a rich history
I can give you a historical note on that, Senator. My maternal grandfather, William Epps, was, I call, one of the first purveyors of parcel post. Okay. He had a business, a delivery service, a moving service with a horse and buggy. Okay. I still have his business card. Really? Okay, and he kept a stable. It was a street down in Newark where they had stables, Calumet Street.
That's right.
And that's where he kept his horses.
That's right.
So see, these kinds of things
yes.
are the history of Newark that we try to keep going.
And I think that's important because now we don't have horses downtown. We have vendors on the corner, but the concept never changed.
It's still the same.
It's still the same, right?
Right.
You know, so I think it's important. And you're right, Broad Market was very flourishing. But what else was, if you remember those days in the history, okay, is you didn't have to come downtown to shop.
Right.
You could actually shop on Prince Street, Charleston Street.
Yeah,
you could shop on Clinton Avenue. Clinton Avenue, Chancellor Avenue had fur shops, jewelry, clothing stores, etc. Okay, and then it was transition. We had many movies downtown.
Yes.
When you go to Broad Market, everything was a movie. It was R.O.K. Proctor's, Adams, whatever it was a movie. And then you had your bowling alleys.
Yep.
These are the things that our viewers need to know that's missing from the city of Newark. When we talk about gang violence, we talk about family values. When you take away those kinds of activities and amenities to a city, you do a great detriment, a great harm to a city. Our young people have no place to go. And you know, we walked around because everybody didn't have a car back then. Yeah. And my generation came after yours, and we still didn't have a car back then, okay? Yeah. If you got one, everybody got into the same car. But we could take a bus, and we knew how to navigate those buses, you know, route after route, and when to make the transfer and where to walk. We need to have that history because the history tells us that we need to put those things back in place. There's no reason a city the size of Newark, even though it's smaller than most big urban cities in other states, there's no reason that we shouldn't be flourishing with some of the things we had before. Not to have a bowling alley is pathetic. Right. You know, not to make the theater that we do have work the way it should work is pathetic. And I think a lot of that has to do because families don't have any place to take families anymore. You know, young people can start hanging out downtown again. You got some nice little clubs coming up. There's some eateries coming up if you want to do that kind of thing. But for the little tots and things, it's really not much to do. And if you don't have the revenues to go outside of town, then you can't do it. The history you're talking about is the history where you could actually go to S. Klein, and Christmas time, there are all kinds of activities in there. You could ride the trains around in little places and stuff like that. So that's important. But what is your perspective as it relates to, you know, the importance of knowing the history?
Again, it puts things in perspective.
I mean,
there's such power in stories. If these stories can be captured and told, you know, we had Ken Gibson and George Richardson and Laurie Stokes come in and talk about the first generation of black politicians in Newark. Assemblyman Giblin has taken part in several of our programs. He could talk about the early days in Vailsburg and go down each side of the street and say who lived where at what number and all that, or bring his own, the experience of his father in the Charter Change movement 50 plus years ago. These stories have power, and they provide lots of ways for individuals to connect to different parts of of Newark's history, and to see how things can happen here. Futures can be built, dreams can be carried out. And one of the things that we have found is that our partnerships with other organizations, with the Newark Public Library, with the New Jersey Historical Society, with NJPAC, we hold programs in each of those places, with Rutgers Newark, but allows us to focus on bringing these stories out and filling in the texture of Newark's history, which is so great. It goes back more than 350 years.
Yes.
And things that happened in Newark inform and help people understand the larger American experience, because it happened here too.
And I would like to maybe paraphrase an expression you hear in terms of understanding history. If you don't know where you've come from,
that's right,
you won't know where you're going.
And that's true.
Okay.
And I think that holds true with what I should be doing at the legislature. I mean, our members should be reminding people, and we do, that look, you go no place in this state without the urban cities. It's just not going to happen. And you continue to put down, but you're slowing the growth of other communities. Where Newark goes, we always say others goes. But it's the same with Patterson and Jersey City. The big cities make a difference. We have these gateways. We had the industries. There's talk now about bringing industries back, because both of you know, and you in particular, Ward, know that we didn't have to go through all this IT stuff that nobody wanted to interview for a job. You could actually walk down the street and walk in a place.
Yeah.
And either they were hiring you or not, but they interviewed you right there. And jobs was flourishing, with manufacturing and some with sweatshop. I understand that, okay? But it's just the idea that you can stay employed, you can feed families. There may have been discriminatory practices, but everybody had opportunities back then. The city itself was rich with diversity, a little different diversity than you have today, because the Jewish community was very, very populated this city very much so. But there are kids interacting with the school with people like myself, Ward, and others, okay? The fathers own the candy stores and the grocery stores, and I think I still owe them some money, or they owe me some, I don't know who, because you could sign for stuff back then, And Danny Peabody Smith, one of my best friends, I think he still works with the UN now, always knew one day he's going to be wealthy because his father was taking all my pennies for the candy when we go to the store. And the jelly donuts and stuff like that, okay? But they live over top of the business. And I had this conversation yesterday with some folk, and I had it with others in the past. I said, you know what? One of the things that's hurting cities, some kind of way we need to get this new generation of quote-unquote young investors, okay, to say, look, it's good to go into business. It's nice to know you have a store downtown, okay? It's nice to know you have a neighborhood store if you have one. But why don't you live in the property? Okay, why are you paying a mortgage and I don't know, Scotch Plains someplace, okay, and riding around in a big car, and then trying to still pay for a lease on a thing when you can just pay the lease, live there, you have built-in security, that helps us, okay, you have value, and as you get a little older, move on out, but we have to get people to stay, and that's what happened back in the historical part of our city, or those days rather. People live here. They live here like you do now, Tim. They raised the families here, good times and bad. What hurt this city was when people fled in 1967. And I'm talking about from all ethnic groups. People had a little bit of money. Black folks decided they're going to East Orange. They weren't going too far.
That's still correct.
Others was going to Irving because they didn't want black folk over there. They weren't going too far. Others went to Orange. They weren't going too far. If you really was moving to suburbs, you went to Plainfield. And that wasn't going too far. And if you turn and look at the cities that I named, they all have urban problems right now, the same ills. So it didn't make any sense in transitioning, because the problems that we have in these cities were caused by families. And to be quite frank, it was caused by the families in the aggregate, black, white, and Latinos, but in the aggregate, it's a move to those cities because you have to take your kids with you. If you don't take the discipline with you, then you're going to destroy another community. Right. So, that's interesting. Now, Tim, let me ask you, what's the relationship to the history? How do you see it? Do your group see the relationship and the history of getting it outside of Newark, the impact on the state? Is there something that your group or anyone is doing to connect with state history or the state history societies they have such a thing? You understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of ways in which we're doing that. One is, and I think this is positive, we're bringing back a lot of people who moved away and are connecting again with Newark in a positive way. The other is that we are sponsoring something called the Newark Archives Project, and we are identifying and describing collections that provide and materials that provide insights into to Newark's history. And what we're finding is that people all over the state are connecting and are taking a fresh look at Newark and at Newark's history. Yes. It is our stories are being told at conferences around the state. One of our trustees now is who teaches at William Patterson got so interested in Newark and World War I that he's writing a book about it now. He's written about England in World War I, but now he's going to do it about Newark and World War I. I'm interested in the colonial history of Newark and hope to write a book about Newark in the colonial period. We have another member who's approaching it through sport. He's writing about soccer, not only in Newark but in Kearney as well. Yes. And these stories make their way throughout the state. Newark is the most important city in the state and has been since the early 18th century. And that story needs to continue to be told as we kind of recreate the city and grow the city in the 21st century.
Over the 15 years of the existence of the Newark History Society, we have given upwards of 70 programs. In every one of them, you look at the titles, they all say Newark.
Okay.
Every one has, that's an absolute requirement. When we're coming up with a title for a program, it must say Newark. Because we want people to always know that's our focus. Is Newark.
Is Barbara Kukla a part of your organization?
Barbara is.
We love Barbara. She's been writing about jazz and
that's
music,
it. She did a program for us on Newark Jazz, and this November we have a really interesting program coming up on Sarah Vaughan. At NJ PAC. We're bringing in Elaine Hayes, who wrote a recent biography about Sarah Vaughan, but we're creating a panel with Barbara Kukla. John Schreiber, who worked with Sarah Vaughan, and Walt Chambers, who, was it your cousin?
Yes, was a very close friend. And Sarah Vaughan and her family came out of our family church, the Mount Zion Baptist Church on Broadway.
So that's going to be part of the James Moody Festival at NJ PAC next November. So Barbara is part of this as well. She's done such good work.
She's carried us for so long, even with the Star Legend. When the Star Legend was painting us badly, she would make sure that the story got told. That's why we love her too.
And we have another reporter. Who's that? He's a part of our group as well, a retired reporter from the Ledger, Guy Sterling.
Oh yeah, Guy old Northwood. Guy's a man.
Guy's a part of our organization.
He's still wearing his beard now?
No, not quite.
Oh, Tim made him shave it, huh? Okay, all right, okay. So Walt, now we know Tim kind of told us how he got involved in Newark History Society. How'd you wind up in Newark History Society?
Thank you for asking. I was recruited to participate in the program in 2006. Warren Grover, one of the co-founders, and I really didn't know Warren, but he called me up, and they had a program. The general title was Seeking Common Ground. It was about interracial organizations in the city of Newark, and they were focusing on one in the Clinton Hill area. There was a Clinton Hill Neighborhood Council founded by the late Stanley Winters.
Yes.
And it was just at the time I mentioned I started in a work in the city of Newark, the Mayor's Commission, and that was my first assignment to work with the neighborhood council.
And Stanley Winter was the president of Prudential.
No, that's a different.
That's
that
different
was Bob
Winter.
Winters.
Which Winter you're talking about?
That was Bob Winters, but Stanley Winters taught at NJIT and was a real activist, but particularly in the Clinton Hill area.
All right. I wanted to be clear with the public. There was two Winters. Of course, people remember Winters, president, who was very good to the city, walked the streets, etc.
This one is Stanley.
And we also know that the council, Clinton Hill Neighborhood Council, you also had a person coming behind that was very active with that name group. It may have been a different group. Was Wilbur Carnegie. Okay, he took over that name, I guess, after it kind of faded. Yeah.
But anyway, I was brought in as a panelist with that program, and of course, immediately fell in love with the organization and started coming to all the programs. Well, look at the list of 70 programs. There are very few I ever missed.
Okay.
And then I was invited to become a part. And as I look back on it, as we just celebrated our 15th anniversary in November, and we produced a keepsake book which published all of copies of all of our posters. Every program has a flyer that advertises, and artfully done by a gentleman named Bob Hartman. And I found, my goodness, since I've been here in 2006, I've been directly involved in some 9 programs.
Okay.
So, and a wide range. Even a program that I chaired on Mayor Leo P. Carlin.
Okay, is that right?
And Giblin was an important part of that.
He knows that history.
Yeah, he knows it in detail.
That's it. You don't have to. He can write his own books, you know.
Yes.
Senator, we'll leave you a copy of our keepsake at the end.
Okay. Now, Tim, how did you maybe you didn't say, how did you get involved with the Newark History?
Well, I was a friend of Charles Cummings and got to know Warren Grover this way. Charles knew that I had a lot of interest in Newark history, and I must say my own interest has gotten a lot deeper through this organization, particularly as I've explored the colonial history.
Well, let me ask you a question, because you come from kind of a Wall Street type background. You come from an investor type background, okay? So you arrive in Newark because of that?
Well, I came to Newark to take a job with Prudential.
Okay.
And I had a PhD in history, and I was working in New Haven at Yale University, and I came to New Haven, and the more time I spent here, the more I wanted to find out what the background was.
Yeah, because I was trying to connect that investment side, that kind of side to the history, the interest in the history. But you just said that you came with a PhD in history, so history's always been a part of you. You know, a person who also could give a lot of history, God bless his soul, was Donald Payne Sr.
Oh, yeah, what a good man.
And he was a historian. He was a history major too. He's educated, but he was a history major, okay? Yeah.
See, Don and his brother Bill and I were contemporaries.
That's right. In fact, they did some Prudential stuff too. Yeah. They was over at Prudential one time.
Sure did. Yeah, they were involved there. Yes.
So what are some of the programs that you mentioned 70 programs, but what are some of the programs that you participate in, or black community and stuff like that?
Well, I was counting it up. Probably we've done 18 or 19 programs. About a quarter of our programs have related to the black community. Our third program was on Queen of Angels. The
old Cap School
is
and
no
church
longer there,
Cap School and
unfortunately.
Church,
but as I say, we Newark Jazz on the first generation of black leadership. A program on Mayor Gibson's time as mayor, and which he took part in. The late Bob Curvin was one of our trustees and did good work for us. we had to move a program to the Billy Johnson Auditorium at the Newark Museum because the response was so strong to the program that he did on Newark in the 1960s.
Yeah, but
from his perspective on CORE and
they had, I think they had a relationship back there. That was CORE.
That was CORE, right. Yeah, absolutely.
That was CORE, right?
I give them credit for my career in the telephone company.
Right.
Bob was raising the hell back
Bob
there.
was pointing things out, and that's how Walt became the first black executive of a Newark corporation. But we also threw a good book party for Bob. That was at NJ PAC to launch Inside Newark.
And that was in July of 2014,
right?
Just a year before Bob died.
Yeah. So, and then Linda Epps, who's the former director of the New Jersey Historical Society, a resident of James Street, and one of our trustees, did a marvelous program on the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to Newark, telling the stories particularly through the experience of women. Our next program in March, we have Mary Sue Sweeney Price, the former director of the Newark Museum, along with Krista Clark, the curator of global arts there. She's now a Hutchins Fellow at Harvard, coming to tell the story of Lyda C. Broner, who was a black businesswoman in Newark who got interested in the indigenous arts from South Africa in pre-apartheid South Africa, went there several times, formed this really interesting collection, eventually left to the Newark Museum. But we're doing a whole program about her work in drawing attention to these art forms. Later this year, we're doing a program on Martin Luther King's visit to Newark in 1968, which came just days before his assassination. And Mark Krasovic of Rutgers Newark is putting together a panel on that. And we want to explore the reaction in Newark to MLK's assassination. It was different than in some other cities. And what Professor Krasovic's perspective is that some of the work that was done in the community following the summer of 1967 made a difference to what he called the cool spring of 1968. So that's going to be an interesting program. In between, we're doing a program on what we're calling the rise and fall of German Newark. You mentioned industries in Newark. The Germans were so involved in building industrial companies in Newark, particularly in the 19th century. And the last program we're doing this year is a little different. We're going to do it on Newark and apple cider. Newark had the best apple cider in the country. President Jefferson, this goes back to the early 19th century, there were orchards along Broad Street and High Street into the Oranges in Montclair. Newark apple cider was reckoned to be the best. So when President Jefferson wanted apple cider early in the 19th century, he got in touch with the congressman from Newark and said, send me 8 barrels. So we're doing a program on Newark apple cider. Who knew?
That's interesting because I've never heard, and I've been around a little bit too, about Newark and apple cider.
Yeah, no,
I heard about Newark and beer. That's
beer,
where the Germans came in. We had the beer.
Yeah.
That's why some of the brewers had the best water.
Cider, and it was hard cider too.
But it's interesting. I tell my wife and I tell younger people, when I grew up in Newark, and Walt, you can relate to this. I actually grew up on Clinton Avenue between West Alpine and Bigelow, right behind Southside. And Hillside. I live on Hillside Avenue, and then we moved to Seymour. But when I lived on Hillside Avenue, I'm telling you, I don't care where you went in the neighborhood, in the backyards that we used to jump the fence and play in, everybody had a grapevine and apples and pears and peaches and little gardens. I always said, whatever happened to those, And I guess the environment and the pollutions must have taken them out. And I think a lot of that's because of the diversity we had with the Italian community and Polish and Jewish, etc. But we had so many fruit pieces here, but I never thought about the fruits being to the point where it came apple cider city, There's actually
a company now called Ironbound Cider, which I find ironic because the Ironbound was perhaps the only place there weren't orchards, but they branded a new cider drink called Ironbound Cider, and they're trying to bring back the so-called Harrison and Canfield apples, which were the secret to
Okay.
to Newark apple cider.
Well, you know, I was
So there's a story there.
I was at, and I don't know if you have a relationship with Anheuser-Busch. There's some history there. Maybe you should have one. But the last time I was out there, what they were trying to do, and I don't know if they're putting this in the stores or not yet, but they were looking at and putting the beers that's brewed in Newark, they're putting Big Newark on it.
Well, that would
And
be
the
one
beer
thing.
that's brewed out in, say, St. Louis, they're putting, St. Louis on it.
Yeah.
You may want to talk to them about that and see where that's going, because there may be a way of also keeping Newark out there, because there's what's everything you do, you put Newark on.
Oh, that's right.
And you may be able to get involved with them, and it may even get them to lend some support to you, since you never asked,
Right.
some financial support possibly, or some in-kind support on some of the things you're doing,
Sure.
because they've been a part of Newark rich history.
They really have,
with the Krugers and the Ballantines and everybody else.
We did a program on beer, the beer industry. in
And
Newark.
we had a retired executive from Anheuser-Busch telling the story of the Newark brewery.
Right.
But it continues, and it is the survivor,
Yes,
since the
yes.
others are no longer here.
Exactly,
Wow.
exactly.
I want to comment on when you're talking about some of the programs that we
Yes.
did. Absolutely, one of my favorites. All of them are my favorites. But
Right.
if you press me, what's your top five? This would be among them. We did a program in, God, hard to believe, it's been we're going on 8 years, in 2010, called A Time of Hope.
Okay.
Newark's Blacks in the 1950s.
Okay.
And we had a great panel, Bob Curvin, Fred Means, Gloria Bryant, and I was fortunate enough to be the moderator. But the unique thing about that program was, I told you we have a flyer for every program.
Excuse me.
And the picture on the flyer for this program was Irvine Turner,
Okay.
Newark's first black councilman.
Councilman, that's
okay.
right.
Your predecessor.
That's
your
right.
history.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. Yeah.
And another point I failed to mention when you mentioned about the gardens and all, I don't think I mentioned when I talked about my background that I spent my formative years in a housing project. And I always want to speak about that because, unfortunately, in recent years, public housing's gotten a bad name. It wasn't that way always. No. I grew up, spent my formative years in the first public housing project in Newark, Pennington Court. Okay, still there.
Still there.
That was really a community in every way. It was, to some degree, integrated in that there were 4 units, 3 were white and 1 was Negro, as they said at the time. But the point, in fact, that it was a real community. And I think and I lived there during the war years, World War II. I moved in 1942 and left when I got married in 1956. I could never get my mother to move, and she died there in 1988.
God bless her. Yeah.
But during the war years, we had what they called, shrub areas and grass. Those were converted into plots, garden plots, if you wish, to grow things.
Okay.
And it was a fascinating experience of all of us who wanted to have a little plot to grow. And it was great.
These stories are such a good way into history, and that's what I would hope that young people or people of any age would be asking those a little bit older than they are about their stories. How did the family come to Newark? What sort of jobs did they have? Get out some old photographs and say, who was that? And write the names on the backs, because that's lost. The personal stories are a way into the larger story, into the larger history. And, one of the most exciting projects in Newark now, building on that Great Migration program, is the Newark Public Library got a major grant from the Carnegie Corporation and has digitized its materials related to the Great Migration and to blacks in Newark, and has done the same thing with its Latino immigrant experience materials. So people can now go online to the library website and find materials easily that may relate to their family, or they may have materials that they want to add to the collections. This is how you find how you're connected to the larger American story.
So we don't have a lot of time, but a couple of questions. Talk about the archives. That's important, but also How do we get these stories out to people? I mean, it's the public school system. We're getting it back now, so maybe that'd be a different kind of relationship, and maybe that should be one relationship. Maybe the Newark History Society should start right now talking to the acting superintendent and the mayor, because the mayor's historian too. He loves history. Okay, about a different kind of relationship with the schools. How do we get in there and tell these stories? How do they create programs that almost indirectly mandate that students have to ask those questions, okay? You know, projects where today you have to go and find somebody and come in and, you know, et cetera, okay? I mean, talk about those kinds of things when we talk about building relationships.
Absolutely. And the Newark 350 organization was working on a Newark curriculum. I need to find out where that stands, because early in the 20th century, there was a Newark curriculum, and that made a real difference as people came from so many different places, so many different countries.
Right.
Both migrants from the South, immigrants from a number of European countries. And this said, you're in Newark, this is how we got here, let's figure out how we can go forward. One of the things we helped support was putting Charles Cummings' Knowing Newark columns online. So those are columns. He wrote 500 columns about Newark history, and the Knowing Newark website is keyword searchable, so you can find your way into stories that way. The Newark Archives Project, which I mentioned earlier, if you're looking on any topic or looking for material, whether it's for a high school paper or a college paper or family history, the Newark Archives Project, and again, you just type that into a search engine and you'll find it, is the best way to find materials that will help you explore that story and do your research. But yes, engaging young people in these stories is part of the larger goal. We're pleased that we have a number of high school history teachers involved with what we're doing, and they're taking some of our programs back into their classrooms.
So what about having the schools have, each school have a Newark History Society subgroup of yours?
Yeah,
well. So they can do some research and they can bounce off you? You know, maybe you should think about that. There's
so much to do, and Senator Rice, I'm also involved in the Newark Public Library, and that's where I'm excited about this program, digitizing those materials, because the other half of that project is to develop exhibits and take them into the schools and develop a curriculum around some of these materials related to African Americans in Newark and to the Latino immigrant experience, and that way really engage students, and we hope they talk to their parents and to their aunts and uncles and grandparents and neighbors and get a sense of the larger story in that way.
Tim is modest. He said, I'm involved with the library. He's chairman of the board of directors of the Newark Public Library.
That's what I thought. You know, I still pay attention to where people are. I'm not on the council anymore. I still have to watch who's where.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question. We can maybe wrap up.
Sure.
How do you become a member if you want to become a member of the society? And do you collect, you know, historical kinds of things? And if so, where you take them? Because I don't know where you keep them.
Well, we decided that we would not collect materials. That the library, Marion Bolden's program collecting materials on the public schools, the New Jersey Historical Society, other groups have good collections. We're glad to provide advice on what might be the right home for collections. We invite anyone to our programs. Our programs are always open to the public without charge. Go to newarkhistorysociety.org and we welcome you to become a member. Our dues are only $25. We'd love to see you.
Okay, I want to thank our viewers for tuning in. I want to thank our guests. That ends our program. You can hear the music coming up, and that means it's a wrap. Have a good day, and don't forget to tell your friends about this program. The New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus from Trenton to you. Thank you very much.